We're going to be talking about workflow actions today. We're not going to get into the triggers. That's going to be tomorrow's session. So we're splitting these two up because obviously I think there's 16 actions maybe and 14 triggers, or it could be vice versa, but we do have a lot of actions and triggers. So splitting this up into two separate sessions gives me the opportunity to really deep dive into each one and not have to rush through anything because I hate rushing. So this will give me an opportunity to deep dive into each one specifically. So let's get into the material today. And we're going to basically talk about three different groups of action. So we're not going to go from top to bottom because actually the way that our UI is set up, it makes a little bit more sense to group them in a different way versus just going from top to bottom in the list. We're going to cover all of them, but we're going to group them more into different categories so it kind of makes sense. And those three categories that we're going to look at today is sending content through the workflow, workflow management, and then project management. So those are kind of the three different categories that we will explore today. So let's start off with sending content. This is going to be probably the most popular one. It's basically when you send content out to the client, which is primarily what the workflow is for. So we're going to start with this because it's the most popular. It's what most people do. And it's also probably the section that most people are confused on how it works. Whenever I'm on the phone with someone and I'm looking at how they set up their workflow or I'm auditing something, potentially that's going to be the biggest hurdle, is understanding how content is sent through the workflow. So we're going to start with that. So before we get into sending content, this is something that if you can wrap your head around this concept, it will help you so much with workflows, and it will just help you when you're sending things manually through Dubsado. Obviously, the goal with this series is to build a workflow, and that's what we're going to do. But if you need to send things out manually before you actually get your workflow set up, this concept right here is going to help you out so much. When sending templates in Dubsado, so if you're sending a scheduler or a form or a contract, questionnaire, proposal, when sending templates in Dubsado, you will always select or apply the content first, what it is that you're going to be sending first. Then you choose the email that goes with that content. If you remember from yesterday, we talked about how important it is to have an email that goes with whatever content it is that you're sending out. If you're sending a questionnaire, you need an email that's going to go with that questionnaire. But whenever you're going to send this in Dubsado, it's kind of the reverse of how you would typically write an email. Most people, when you're in, let's say, Gmail, you'll write an email and then you'll attach a form to it. Dubsado is literally the exact opposite of that. So it takes some getting used to, but how it works in Dubsado is you pick the content you want to send first. So I'm going to go grab my questionnaire, or I'm going to go grab my scheduler template or proposal. Then once I go to send it, I'm going to choose the canned email that goes with it. If you can remember that that's how Dubsado works, it will make your life so much simpler whenever you're building your workflows and getting into that piece of it. So let's talk about the first one here, which is send email. Okay. Send email is perfect for sending any text-only emails. And what I mean by that is that you don't have an attachment with it, a Dubsado template like a scheduler, or you don't have a form, a contract, questionnaire, different things like that that you're attaching to this action. It's just for kind of a plain text-only email. So let's jump into Dubsado here, and we're actually going to look at these actions here specifically. So if I'm in Dubsado, and I know maybe some of you have experimented with workflows and different things like that, if you're not familiar with this, we're going to deep dive into how to set up the workflow a lot more next week. So when you're building a workflow here, and when you're building a workflow action, these are going to be the different things that you have to choose from, your action, what it is that you want to do. And as we walk through some of these things today and tomorrow, you're going to start to realize, oh, this is why I need to write out what it is that I want to do, when it's supposed to go out, and then which piece of content goes out. You're really going to start to see that here as we kind of move forward in this process. So What you can do here, so we're going to start with send email. Okay, so we'll click send email, and that's going to be the action on what we choose. Now we're going to skip over when, because that's going to be all day tomorrow. That's going to be our whole session tomorrow, is talking about when and how all of that works. But the next thing we're going to talk about just for this action here is where you click this drop down and you can choose the canned email that you want to use to send out. So the main thing that I want you to take away from this send email action is that everything, if you're going to use this action, it should only be where you're just sending out text. So in this email, it's just saying, thank you so much for your interest in working together. I'm excited to learn more about your project. I'll follow up in 24 to 48 hours. You'll notice in this email that there's no attachments. I'm not sending a form. I'm not sending a scheduler or a questionnaire or proposal. None of that is here in this email. This is just a plain text email. So if you're going to use this action, send email, you need to make sure that there are no attachments that are going to be in this body. Okay. Now, some tips for you. This is going to be really good for people who maybe have already started workflows and they're thinking about updating things. This is going to also be reiterated next week when we talk about updating workflows. That's our final session next Friday. So you'll probably hear this more than once, but it does help to understand how this works. Changes you make to the body of a canned email within the workflow action will not affect your master template. So what do I mean by that? If I come in here and I say, thank you so much for your interest, remember, this is a canned email that I'm using. If I come in here and I say, please let me know if you have any questions, and I write that into this workflow action, it will update this workflow, but the problem is it's not going to update my master canned email template. That is something that a lot of people do. They'll come into the workflow here and they'll just type emails in here, which technically you can do, but I don't advise doing that. Here's why. If you were to build this workflow action, so let's say I add this action into the workflow. So now I have just a generic email in there. If I ever delete this action for any reason, that email, however I reformatted it, is now gone. The only thing that I have is my old canned email in my templates area. So it's very important, and that kind of leads me into the next thing here on this outline. While you have the ability to type in that email body, you can absolutely do that. Instead of selecting a canned email, whatever you type there will not be saved as a canned email, and it would be lost if you ever decided to delete that action. If you need to change an email, that means you need to update the wording of something or change how things are phrased. Make the edits to your canned email. So go to templates, go to your canned emails, grab that email and make your changes, then come back into the workflow and just simply reapply that email in this list. Emails, and this is also something that's going to be very important. I don't have this in the outline, so for those of you who are here live, this is going to be very beneficial. The only thing in the workflows that do not auto-update are canned emails. If you update a form, if you update a scheduler template, if you update questionnaires, anything like that, it's going to auto update in your workflow. But right now in the system, the only thing that will not auto update is canned emails. So if you ever make a change, make sure you're going back into the workflow and reapplying that email. I know it's kind of tough because you think that everything auto updates, which it almost does, but canned emails is the last thing we need to do in the system to actually get them to auto update. So that's very, very important when you are editing your workflows. And we'll talk more about that in the last session on updating your workflows. But that's just some good bonus information for you. But the main takeaway from this action is this is only for text-only emails. No forms, no schedulers, contracts, proposals, none of that go in there. And the reason why for that is going to make more sense when we get to this next action here. So the next action we're going to talk about is send form. Sending a form, if you're going to use that action, that is if you're going to send out a proposal, a sub-agreement, or a questionnaire. One of those three forms, if when you're writing out your process, if you remember from yesterday, one of the actions that I wrote out was email the pre-wedding consultation questionnaire. So if I'm planning on sending out a questionnaire or sending out a proposal or sub-agreement, I'm going to use send form every single time. You're going to know more about this on Monday when we talk about translating your process into Dubsado. But anytime you are sending one of those three forms, you have to use send form. You cannot use any other action. So a couple tips here. Number one, you can only send one form at a time using this action. And when I actually go into that action, it will make more sense why, but you can only send one form at a time. If you need to send more than one form at a time in an email, you can either upload the forms to the client portal and just have the workflow upload 3 or 4 or 5 forms into the client portal and have them log in and fill out all those forms. Or you can do it manually where you can send out multiple forms in one email manually. But from a workflow perspective, when we're talking about automation, then you can only do one form at a time. So one proposal per email, one sub-agreement per email, or one questionnaire per email. That's just the way the system is built. And like I said, here in a second, you'll understand why it works that way. And the other thing that's very important is you need to have a form link smart field link in the body of the email. So let's take a look at this action, and we're going to talk through a couple things here. So I'm just going to remove this action. We're just going to use this workflow template just to break down each one of these. So let's talk about send form. Okay. So again, we're going to skip over the triggers. We're not going to worry about that today. The first thing I want you to see when we're doing send form, and this has to do with anytime you're sending out content to a client, sending out a form, sending out an email, sending out an appointment scheduler, different things like that. When we talked yesterday, we talked about how important it is to identify if you need to approve something before it goes out. Workflows do not have to be 100% automated. You can have control over when certain things go out. Maybe you want to hold something before it goes out. Maybe you want it to be 100% automated. How you can control that is right here underneath this when section. You can actually check this box that says require approval before completing this action. If you check this, here's what happens. Once it gets to this action in the workflow, it's going to send you an email that says, hey, do you want this to go out yet? If you don't want it to go out yet, you can go into their project and make updates to the canned email that goes out, to the form that goes out. You can make those updates and then approve it to go out to the client. So you don't need to worry about everything being 100% automated. If you want it that way, you can just uncheck that. And that's really all you need to do to control if something is automated or if you want to approve something. So as you're writing out your process, which is the homework from yesterday, when you're writing that out and you're identifying, oh, this action, I need to approve this, or this proposal is going out, I need to approve this first. When you're looking at it from a workflow perspective, that just means that you're going to check that box. That's literally all that means. So that's how the approval works. The next thing we're going to talk about are sending form options. And this also works with the scheduler as well, but we're going to use it for forms here. This section right here where you see send form options, this is specifically to basically tell the workflow where you want to send it. I don't really have this necessarily as part of how you should write out your workflow because it kind of adds more complications to it, because when you're writing out your action, you could say, I want to upload this to the client portal. I want to email this to the client. So that's kind of where your where comes into place. But here, you basically have 3 options anytime you want to send a form out to the client. Number 1, you can send it via email to the client, and that also means that it gets applied to the portal. This is going to be the most common option because obviously if I'm wanting to email a questionnaire to the client, I'm going to choose send email and apply to portal. Some people get confused on what that means and apply to portal. What that means is if I send a questionnaire to a client, or let's say I send a contract or a scheduler template to the client, it's also going to go into the portal. Anytime something is sent via email, it's automatically uploaded into their client portal. This helps because now if you send something via email to a client, you don't also have to say, oh, do I need to also upload that to the portal? Which you don't. So if you do send email, that's automatically going to make it available in the portal, so you don't have to double up and send it via email and also put it in the portal. So that's what this means here, and it's probably going to be the most common option. The other options that you have is apply to portal. Like I said earlier, there are some situations, especially maybe if you're in the design field or if you're in the coaching industry, where you need the client to fill out maybe 4 or 5 forms in order to kind of get them onboarded or to get more information. If you use apply to portal, what that means is that the workflow, once it gets to this action, is just going to send it directly to the portal. The client's not going to have access to it. It's just going to send it directly into that portal for you. That's a great option if you want to do maybe 4 or 5 forms in there and then send a portal email out. That's a great option for you. The other option here is apply to project only. This is a really great option if you're just wanting this to get uploaded into their project first. Then you could make some changes, some edits to it, and then you decide when you want to send this out. It's completely manual whenever you want to send this out. Some good reasons for this would be, let's say you're wanting to upload a questionnaire into their project, and then as you're on the phone with them, maybe during a consultation, you can just have this internal form that the client doesn't have access to, and you can just fill out this form while you're on the phone with them. That's a really great example. Maybe if there's another specific form that you need to just get into the project, and then you can go ahead and fill it out at another time or send it to them at another time. That's a great reason for apply to project only. But this gives you those 3 different options. If you're doing apply to portal or apply to project only, you're only going to need to choose the form that you want to send. So it's very simple, very straightforward. Let's say I want to apply to portal, then I can scroll through all of my forms and I can choose which one I want to send out. Here's where people get kind of confused though, is if we choose send email and apply to portal, now we have a lot more content here that we need to hone in on. So let's break this down, and we're going to use that same logic that we started out with. If you're using send form, anytime you're sending a Dubsado attachment or a form or a template, you're always going to pick the content that you want to send first. Then you choose the email that goes with that particular document or that attachment. So what I'm going to do first here is I'm going to choose and I'm going to pick which one I want to send out. So let's say that I want to send out an intake questionnaire. So I have this there. I've picked my form first. Now I'm going to choose the email that I want to send out with it. And it just so happens that I have an intake questionnaire email that I've already drafted. Now, a couple things before we dive into this here is I want you to kind of understand why when you're writing out your process and you're building all of the content ahead of time, why this is going to work out so nicely. If you were here for yesterday's session, if you remember from yesterday, we talked about when you're writing out your actions, when you're going to send a form or send a scheduler, you're using the phrase email the blank. And that way you don't forget to write that canned email. If you set it up that way, now look how easy it is to set up a workflow. All you need to do is literally just choose whatever form you're going to send. And then the email that you wrote that goes with that, all you have to do is pull that up and boom, you have a workflow action together. That simple. Where people get into trouble is they might have built their intake questionnaire, and then when it asks, okay, what email do you want to use to send it? They say, oh, I haven't written my email for it. I need to go out of here and write my email, then come back into the workflow. That can get so tedious going in and out of the workflow. Whereas if you have built all of your content ahead of time, all it is here is just matching things together. Intake questionnaire, let me grab my intake questionnaire email, and you pair those two things together. So the last thing that I had on this particular action is the form link smart field needs to be in the body of the email. So what does that look like in practice? A lot of people skip over this, or they don't really pay attention to this here, but there is a little bit of kind of like a warning, if you will, but it tells you make sure this template includes this form link in the body of the email. The reason you need this in there is because that's going to create the button for the client to click on. A lot of people will always say, if I have a form link in here, how do I know what form is going to go in there? This is simply just a placeholder, because what's actually going to happen is you have your form link here, and how it knows which form to put in there is because you've already pre-selected it up here. So because you've decided ahead of time, that's going to link it to this form link. That's how it knows where to put it or what form is going to go in there. A lot of people will not really pay attention to that, because what happens is, I'll kind of give you an example of what people normally do. They might say to themselves, well, I want to send an email out to the client. And in their head, they're thinking, I want to send out an intake questionnaire. So what they do is they come into this email, they grab their intake questionnaire email, and that's perfect here. But now think about what happens. You have this form link that's right there, but there's nowhere here to choose what form goes with that form link smart field. That's why you can only send out one form at a time with these workflow actions currently. Because if I do send form, and let's say I grab that intake questionnaire again, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of fool you here a little bit, but it's going to make more sense. Some people, when they're building a workflow action, they might have the right action, send form, and they might have their intake questionnaire in there. But here's what happens. They might have two form links in the body of the email. Now, this right here will be able to link to one of these, but there's nowhere to choose which form is going to go with that second form link button or that bracket there. So that's why you can only do one form per email, is because you have to pre-select which form goes with that form link. And so if you have 2 or 3 different ones in there, then it doesn't know what forms to attach to those other links. So that's very important. Another thing that you need to pay attention to as well, we'll talk about this a little bit more with the send scheduler, send appointment scheduler, is a lot of people will have a form link and a scheduler link in the same email. So let's look at that here. I have an email that I typed that's actually incorrect, but I'll show you why. So in this email, we're still using the exact same thing, send form. Here's my intake questionnaire, but I'm also dropping a scheduler link in there. I've seen this a ton of times. Here's the issue. We have send form. We have the intake questionnaire. That's going to link to the form link, but there's nowhere to choose what scheduler is going to go with that scheduler link. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but that's why you cannot send out a form and a scheduler at the same time. It's not possible right now with the system, because although you can connect the forms together here, the scheduler link, you don't have anywhere up here to choose what scheduler is going to go there. If you hyperlink it into the form, I've seen that a couple times. If you hyperlink it into the actual email here, that actual email or that scheduler will not be added into the project. But we'll get into that later. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but the main thing I want you to take away from this is that you always choose the form, and then you want to make sure that form link is in there so it knows what to connect to that bracket, okay? So that is send form. And again, that is only for proposals, sub-agreements, and questionnaires. You have to use that action if you're sending any of those things via email. All right, the next one, that one took quite a long time to explain all the different send form options and all of that. So the rest of these should move a little bit quicker here. Send contract. This sends the main contract on the project. This is very straightforward. There's not a lot that goes into this. It's not too hard to explain. Basically, your main contract in a project. So you have your main contract. If you're familiar with projects, you can only have one. It's kind of like your primary contract. And if you need people to sign other things, then you use sub-agreements for that. But your main contract should be your terms and conditions, that focal point that people are going to sign off on for their service. The main or a kind of a tip that I want to explain here, though, is if you are combining a proposal, contract, and invoice together, that's very popular. People like to do that. You will not need to send or to use a send contract action in your workflow. It goes out with the proposal. So let me show you what I mean by that. So let's say we're going to do send form, and I'm sending out proposal, contract, and invoice together. In my settings on my proposal, I have all of that bundled together. If I come in here and I choose send form, and then I'm going to grab a proposal here, if I'm adding this in, my contract and invoice, because I bundled it all together with the proposal, it's all going out here in this action. What I don't need to do is come in here and also choose send contract and then pick one of my contracts and then also send that out. This is going to double up your contract. They're going to get a proposal, contract, and invoice on this first action. And then as soon as that gets done, then they're going to get the contract again, which you don't want to happen. So whenever you're doing proposal, contract, and invoice, just remember that you only need to send out the proposal. And because it's connected in the settings on this proposal, it all goes out together. This is one bundle that sends everything out together. That's a common mistake that I see some people make when I'm auditing people's workflows. They might have send form, send contract, send invoice, or create invoice, and they have all of those as separate actions, but you actually don't need to do it that way. It's all contained in one action. So when you're doing send contract, so let's do send contract here. Again, same idea here. You're going to grab this here. You're going to pick the contract that you want to send first. You're always choosing content first. Then down here, you can select what email you want to use to go out with that contract. You still have your different options here. So send email and apply to portal, apply to project. You can still do all of those things. But because it's a contract, it's going to have a different smart field link than if you're just sending out a form. Right here, you'll see where there's an actual contract link. So if you're wanting to send that main contract on the project, you have to make sure, and it actually tells you right here at the top, you want to make sure that that contract link is in the body. So that way it can connect. Okay, here's the main contract for the project. We're going to plug that in this email here. Okay. So that is really simple there with contracts. There's not a lot to it. It's kind of the same idea, except it's just sending out the main contract in the project. Next one, send primary invoice. I do want to break down a little bit because I know we're going to have a lot of questions about what the primary invoice actually is. What does that mean? So I'm going to break all of that down here just so that people understand what we talk about when we say send primary invoice. It's not just send any invoice on the project. It's the primary invoice. So I want to show you first, before I jump into some of the tips and things that I have, what the primary invoice is. When I'm inside of a project, so I'm just going to jump into one of these test projects here, and I'm going to go to the Invoices tab. If you're not familiar with projects, you can have multiple invoices inside of a project. You could have 5, 6, 7 different invoices, especially if you're using recurring invoices. That's going to create multiple invoices inside of this project. When I click on invoice list, so right up here at the top, I'll click invoice list. And in this project, you'll see that I have 3 invoices in this particular project. When I'm using the action send primary invoice, it is looking at this list and it's looking at which invoice is marked as primary. Now, a couple things here. If you only have one invoice in a project, so let's say it's a very standard process, you just have one invoice, they're filling that out, that's always going to default as the primary invoice. So you don't need to worry about marking invoices primary if you only have one invoice on the project. That's going to be most people, so you don't really need to worry too much about that. But what's really important here is if you're using send primary invoice in a workflow and you're wanting a particular invoice to go out to them, you really need to double check on which one is marked as primary when that workflow action kicks in. This is going to be pretty rare for most people because, like I said, most people just have one invoice per project when they're using the workflows in that way. But if you do have maybe multiple invoices in your project, when that workflow action hits, you might need to look at which one is marked as primary. So and this is just kind of a pro tip, if you're thinking about how do I do this, before that send primary invoice triggers, maybe what you want to do is maybe add a to-do above that and change the primary invoice before that action sends out. So that way, you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt that the right invoice is sending out to the client. Again, this is kind of a rare case. A lot of people may not use this, but I did want to throw that in there just in case. So that's what it means by primary invoice. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about where the primary invoice is affected in the system. So we'll get to that on the next slide. So payment reminders should never be sent through a workflow action. Let me go into the workflow here and I will explain. So when you are building a workflow, up at the top, you're going to see right here where you can apply a payment schedule to go with the workflow. So if you're familiar with payment schedules, I can't deep dive into those today, but with payment schedules, you actually build all of your reminders into that payment schedule. Same thing with scheduler templates. We talked about this yesterday at the end of the session. I can't remember who asked the question about the different emails that go with schedulers, but you can put your notification or your appointment reminder emails in the scheduler itself. You don't build those into the workflow, not your payment reminders, not your appointment confirmation emails, or your appointment reminders. Those are built into the payment schedule or the scheduler itself, and that gets added into the workflow. So if I have reminders already set up on my 50/50 payment schedule, those reminders are going to go out automatically just because it's a part of the workflow. I don't need to come in here and say send primary invoice at a certain time. Reminders don't get built into this workflow. The payment schedule that's attached to this workflow, that's going to do your reminders for you. So no need to add it in here as a separate action. So that's one of the tips that I want to share with you. The other one is, and this kind of ties back into what we were talking about a second ago with proposal, contract, and invoice. If you're combining those 3 things together, you don't need to add a send primary invoice action. It's all going to go out with proposal, contract, and invoice. So just like you don't need to add a send contract action, you also don't need to send or put in a send primary invoice action, because it's all contained in that one action that's sending out the proposal. As long as you have it bundled in the settings, it's all going to go out in that same action. So those are 2 tips that I really think will help people when you're building your workflow, so you're not adding all of these extra actions that don't need to be in there, like payment reminders and send primary invoice. You don't need those in there. So the next thing I want to talk about, because I get this question a lot and it's not something that's just kind of common knowledge in Dubsado. So I wanted to share it during this webinar series because the goal is to provide as much value as possible. So the primary invoice impacts 3 places in the system. The first place, and we talked about primary invoice a second ago, the main place that it affects is the invoice on the projects page. If I go into the projects page where I was just at, and you'll see my test project down here. If I click on this, I have 3 different invoices on this project, but the one that shows up on the project page is the primary invoice. This will affect a lot of people who are doing recurring invoices. There is not a way at the moment to just automatically switch primary invoices every single month. But if you're doing recurring invoices, you're going to see in here maybe 8 to 10 invoices that are getting created. But the first one that got created is going to be the primary. So if you're on your projects page and you see that that first invoice got paid on, that doesn't necessarily mean that invoice 9 and 10 got paid on just because you can see that here. You might need to go into the project and look at that particular invoice, unless you're very conscious of every single month updating that primary invoice to the new month. Then it would show up on your actual projects page. But the way the system is built right now, whatever invoice is marked as primary, that goes onto your project page here. So that's one thing that the primary invoice impacts in the system. Number 2 is invoice smart fields. This is also extremely important. And I'll give a very, very perfect example. When you're looking at a contract, there's a lot of people that want to put in whatever they choose on the proposal when an invoice gets created. They want that to go onto the contract. So down here in this contract, a lot of people have it, but they will have invoice smart fields in the actual contract so that it shows what gets put onto that invoice. So if I go underneath smart field and invoice, all of these invoice smart fields that you see here, those are going to pull from the primary invoice. So again, if you have multiple invoices in your project, whatever one is marked primary and you're using these invoice smart fields, that's going to pull information from that particular invoice, not from the one that maybe you're meaning it to. So again, this might be a very small sample size of people who are watching this. Most people, again, just have one invoice per project. It's very simple. You don't really need to worry about the primary invoice. But for those of you who are doing multiple invoices in a project, especially recurring invoice business owners, you need to pay attention to, if this is going out, do I have the right invoice marked as primary before I'm using these invoice smart fields? That's very important to pay attention to. And then the last place, really simple, we're talking about it right now. If you're using the send primary invoice action, it's going to pull the primary invoice, not whichever invoice you want to send out. It's only going to be the primary. So that's just a little bit of bonus tip for you, especially maybe if you're helping someone set up their Dubsado, just to know more information on what's popping up. Just gives you some more ammunition whenever you're building your workflows. Okay, create invoice. Create invoice creates a new invoice in the project from the packages that you preset. So if we go to the workflow here, and we will jump into this exact same, actually, I think I have, yes, I do. So with create invoice here, what you're going to do is you're actually going to preset an invoice that you want it to be. So if you're using proposals, you're probably not going to use this action because the proposal is going to build your invoice. So you don't need to do create invoice action if you're using a proposal. The proposal handles all of that. What this is really great for is if you already know ahead of time an invoice amount that you want to bill somebody, and you don't need to do a proposal or do a contract, you just want to create a quick invoice and send it out to them, you can preset in this workflow, I want to create an invoice for maybe like a registration fee or a session fee for $100, create it, and I'm going to send it out. With this, there's a couple things that you need to pay attention to, and I'm going to try to move through this as quickly as possible because I know we're kind of running low on time already, which is crazy. So with the create invoice action, it's important to know, because right here, you'll see that I'm pre-setting up this invoice and I'm pre-setting a payment schedule that this invoice will have. Something that people do a lot, and it's very important to know, is that if you have a payment schedule in your actual workflow, so as you can see here, I have a 50-50 payment schedule there. How workflows work is whenever you're adding in a workflow into a project, whenever that goes into the project, this payment schedule is going to create an invoice right away. So we have to think about the logic here. If I were to add this into a project right now, it's going to make an invoice right away with a 50-50 payment schedule on there. It's going to be a blank invoice, kind of prepping for whenever someone fills out a proposal. It's going to have a blank invoice with a 50-50 payment on there. If I have this create invoice action next, it's going to make another invoice with this session fee on there with a 34, 33, 33 payment schedule. So now I have two invoices on this project, which I do not want. So it's important to know that if you only want one invoice on a project, just one, you don't need to worry about this create invoice action. If you have a payment schedule here, that's going to make your first invoice. Don't worry about doing create invoice unless you really want two invoices on your project. So, and we'll get into more of that tomorrow when we talk about workflow triggers and adding payment schedules in there and all of that. So we'll discuss that a bit further tomorrow. Now, a big thing here, and I have it kind of laid out, so I won't really go through the tips because I just kind of talked about it. But the main thing here is if you want two invoices, then that's going to happen. But don't do create invoice and also add a payment schedule to your workflow, because now you're going to have two invoices. And that is pretty much everything for create invoice. Send appointment scheduler. So send appointment scheduler kind of is pretty self-explanatory, but it sends an appointment scheduler out to the client. With this action, so let me go ahead and get rid of this, and we're going to choose send appointment scheduler. So let me go back to my workflow and we'll jump into this sample one here. So if I choose send appointment scheduler, and this is also very important, I'm going to talk about this on Monday. If you are wanting to send a Dubsado scheduler template to a client in a workflow, okay? If you're wanting to do that, you have to use send appointment scheduler as your action. You cannot hyperlink a scheduler in here. You can, but it's not going to go into the project that you already have set up. You have to use send appointment scheduler as your action. You can't use send email. And what you're going to need in here is that scheduler link. It's the exact same concept that we talked about with send form, where you're going to choose the scheduler that you want to send. So I'm picking this scheduler ahead of time. I want to use my 30-minute consultation, and then how it knows which scheduler is going to go with this smart field bracket is because I've already preset ahead of time which scheduler goes there. So that's very important. It's the same concept as send form or send contract. Now you're just using it from a workflow perspective and from an appointment scheduler perspective here. So with this, you can also not add in a form if you're using this action. So let's look at an example here. If I were to add in, let's just say in the body of this email, I want to put in a form link, okay? Same concept. I'm going to continue to drill this home just so anyone who's watching this really gets this. I have send appointment scheduler. That's perfect. I've picked my template. Perfect. I have the scheduler link, so it's going to know based off of what I chose there. But if I have a form link in here, there's nowhere to pick what form goes in that bracket area. So I run into that roadblock again. So it's very important to know you cannot do a scheduler and a form together, which actually leads me to my next slide here. This is going to be a very clear sending content cheat sheet. If you download the handout from today, which I hope all of you have, this is going to help you tremendously when you're putting this together. And I'll explain how this works and how this is broken down. When you're building a workflow action, you cannot do these three things ever under any circumstances. You cannot do double forms or triple or quadruple. You can't do double forms. You cannot do double scheduler, and you cannot do form and a scheduler. And the next slide, again, I always love to explain why. So you're really getting that, understanding why it's not possible. But these three over here on the right, you cannot do any combinations of these from a workflow perspective, automating and sending out emails. And we already talked about why, because you can't choose which one goes with the link. Over here on the left-hand side, the maximum that you can put together in one email. So if I wanted to put all these different links into one email action, I can. I might need to apply a contract to the project first. I might need to add the form to the project first, or I need to create an invoice first. You can do any combination of these four or these four. So here's what I mean by that. I can do contract and invoice in one email. I could do contract and portal in one email. I could do portal and form in one email, or I could do invoice and portal if I wanted to. Those I can all do. Any combinations of those four things I can put into one email. So when you're writing out your process and you might say, man, I'm sending out so many emails, I wish I could combine some of these things. Look at this cheat sheet and say, maybe I could do contract, invoice, and portal together in one email. Or maybe I could do form, portal, and invoice in one email. You can absolutely do that. Any combination you want to of these four or of these four. And you're going to see the difference here is that anytime you're using form or scheduler, those have to be separated out. There's no way to combine those and have it actually work well in Dubsado. So if you're ever going through this and you're wanting to have some type of a cheat sheet, this is the best option here. Just know these three options are not possible, but you can make any combination you want to out of these four. If you want to do all four, you can absolutely do that. You might have to make your workflow work the right way, applying the contract, all of that, but you can definitely do it. Okay, why is this possible? I love to talk about why because it will really make it set in and you'll understand. The reason that you can basically just throw a contract or invoice link or client portal link anywhere you want to is because each project can technically only have one of these things. There's really only one contract on a project. There's only one primary invoice, and there's really only one client portal per client. So when I'm putting in these email or these links in an email, let's go back to this example here. Let's say I have a form link, a contract link, an invoice, and a portal link all in the same email. The reason I can do that is because with these three things, you really only have one of those things. So it knows exactly which one to put in there. With forms and schedulers, the reason you can't have multiple is because you could have multiple questionnaires on a project. You could have multiple sub-agreements or multiple proposals or schedulers. And because you have to specify exactly which one you want to go out in that email, that's why you can only do one. With these over here on the left, you don't really have to specify once it's in the project, you don't really have to specify which one. It can only pull from the contract or the primary invoice or the client portal. All of these, you can have as many as you want to. So that's why you're not able to just do however many you want to, like I have here, because you have to specify every single time. So hopefully that makes sense. If you need to go back and re-watch that section there so it really sets in, that will help your workflow building so much. So definitely go back and re-watch that. Okay, the last two sections are much, much shorter, so we should be able to get done pretty close to the right time here. So workflow management, pause workflow. Pausing a workflow prevents the workflow from completing any actions until the workflow is manually unpaused. So let me click out of this here, and I'm going to go into a project and show you what that would look like realistically. So if you have a pause workflow action in a workflow, and let me wait till this opens up here, and we'll go to the workflows tab. And what I'm going to do here is if I add in, let's say we add in this particular workflow. So we just have kind of a basic workflow in here. And let's say that this workflow is paused, okay? So when a workflow gets paused, you're gonna see it right here where it turns yellow. When a workflow gets paused, none of this can go out. No to-dos can get created. Nothing based off of a project date is going out. None of that is happening. Literally, how I like to explain it is that you're basically pushing the emergency stop on a treadmill. It shuts the entire thing down. It doesn't slow it down. It doesn't, make it so only some actions happen. It literally shuts the entire thing down. And the only way to get it running again is to manually go into this particular workflow and unpause it and change it back to active. That's the only way you can get it running again. So because of that, I always say to use the pause workflow very, very sparingly. We have so many other options, which we're going to get into in a second, beyond the approve button, that you can pause the workflow or at least stop it from running until you get certain things done. Before we added the approval action to a workflow, you used to have to just pause the workflow every single time. Most of you are probably newer to Dubsado. Maybe you don't remember those times, but before we had an approve button, you literally had to pause the workflow anytime you wanted the workflow to stop, and it was so tedious. So now that we have an approve button in there, you don't really need to use pause as much as you might think you need to. Only use it sparingly. If you absolutely want the workflow to shut all the way down, then use pause workflow. Hold actions until. This one is very rare, so I'm going to kind of move through this quickly. But for those of you who want to use, you don't want something to happen until 2 triggers or 2+ triggers actually get activated. So let me give a great example. Some people might not want something to happen until a contract gets signed and they also pay a deposit. That's very common for some people. So what you can do here, let me go to hold actions until, is you can actually keep anything from firing until all of the things that have hold actions until are fulfilled. So let me break down this workflow and I'll explain how this works. So let's say right here, I'm sending out a proposal, contract, and invoice. All of this is going out in this action. Now I have hold actions until the contract is signed and hold actions until a scheduled payment is completed. I know we haven't gotten into triggers yet. We're going to do that tomorrow. But basically what I'm saying in these 2 actions here is that I don't want anything to happen until they sign their contract or pay a deposit. Because of those things, the last thing I have is send out a portal and welcome email immediately after all previous actions are complete. Something that's very important with this is that you need to use this trigger. We'll get into it tomorrow, so I won't get too into it here, but you have to use this trigger here if you're using these hold actions, because basically it's going to hold until the contract, it's going to hold until the payment, and then immediately once everything above it's done, now it's going to fire. So if you're using hold actions complete, you have to use immediately after if you are going to use it correctly. This is the only trigger that's going to work with that. And I have it here in the slide. So if you're needing this, when you're setting this up, you can use this as a cheat sheet. Start a workflow. This allows you, and we're not going to really get into it today because it's going to make more sense when we're actually building the workflow, but start a workflow allows you to take two separate workflows and you can link them together. So it's kind of like a bridge where, let's say you have an inquiry workflow, which we talked about yesterday, and you have a booking workflow. And once that inquiry workflow is done, you want it to automatically start that booking workflow. This is how you connect those two things together. And when we actually build out the wedding workflow that we talked about yesterday, when we do that next week, I'm going to implement this start a workflow. So if you're wanting to kind of see how this works live, we're going to actually look at that next week. But this here, this is actually going to start another workflow. Some things to pay attention to with start a workflow though. The same workflow cannot be applied to the project if you're using that. So a lot of people think they can use start a workflow to basically reapply the same workflow. You're not able to do that. You can only apply a different workflow to start. And so it's really great for like the inquiry, booking, booked. So that's how you can kind of think about that process. But again, it'll make more sense next week when we actually put this one into practice. You also don't need to add this to your writing out your workflow process. This is something that you're going to add in later, and I'll show you why next week. So that's going to be start a workflow. Now, the very last thing is we're going to talk about project management. Create to do is something that is so important in a workflow, because a lot of people, like I said, are always thinking about the workflow has to be automated. There's no way for me to actually get things accomplished as far as tasks are concerned in my process. But when you're creating a to-do, it's actually going to hold that workflow until you get that done. So if I go into add action here and I do create to do, this is going to actually create a task for me that I need to get done in the workflow. This is perfect if you're wanting to create tasks before a certain event date, if you want to create tasks before a consultation. If you think about yesterday, I said that I want to prepare for the consultation, so I could create a task for myself to do that. If you're using the example I gave yesterday, all of my tasks are green. This is where you can create those tasks. So if I do create to do, this is going to be right here, the assigned user to this particular task. You can, as you can see here, you can have multi-users get attached to this particular task. But what this means here is that whoever is assigned to this task is going to go onto that user's dashboard. If I'm a solopreneur, I just work by myself, I can choose whether or not I want to have this go onto my dashboard or not. Maybe this task I'm creating, I don't need it to go onto my dashboard. So I can remove that, and it's only going to be a part of my project and my main task list. It's not going to be on my dashboard. If I want this to be on my dashboard, maybe it's a very high priority task, then I can click this and it's going to add it to my particular dashboard, or it could go onto my multi-users dashboard. So that's what the assigned user area is. Now let's get into this section. This is where you're actually going to write out your task. There's something that you can do when you're creating tasks here in your workflow that I think is really great. You can add smart fields to give your task more context. So here's an example. Call, and I'm going to go down here to smart field, and I'm going to put in a client smart field. So call client name. And then what I can also do, if I've collected that information, I could put in smart field and I could put in phone number. So what is this going to do for me? When this task gets created, it's going to say call Travis Wade, and then it's going to put his number in there. So when that happens and it goes onto my dashboard, I don't need to go fiddling through to try to find the phone number for this person. It's going to put it in the task for me. So if you have this, or you want to put something like verify the date for the project with, and then you could put in like smart fields, and then you could put in maybe like the project date smart field, and that is going to show you the date that you need to verify. So all of these different things give your tasks more context. So you're not just putting in this, verify the date for the project with client. That's not going to give you any context when that pops up, and you're going to say, who is this about? What does this mean? So use smart fields to give your task more context. The other thing that you can do is you can do send email reminder. Then again, if you have, let's say, call client name, and let's say you put in the phone number, if you have this going out to you via email, let's say you're having an email sent out to you, I look at my phone, it says call client name, it puts their phone number in there, and now I can just dial that. If you're very mobile as a business owner, this right here will save you so much time. So you don't have to go into the project, find the right client, find the phone number, and then dial them. If it's going to you an email, you can just open it up, boom, there's the number, there's the person, dial it and call them. So that is what you can do with to-dos. You don't have to send out an email if you don't want to, but if you want to, you can, and you can choose this per task, okay? And then I believe the last thing that we have here, and then we'll wrap up. Actually, we have two more things here. Activate and deactivate the client portal. This is going to turn the portal on or turn the portal off. And when we get into the workflow next week, I'll actually show this to you live and some of the things that you can do here. So we won't really dive into this, but basically what this does, and I just want to emphasize this point, is that when you are using the client portal and you say activate portal, it's not going to send something out to the client at that point. It basically just turns it on, and then you need to send out an email with the link and password in there. Next week, when we build the workflow, I'll show you exactly how to do that. So no worries, we'll look at that live and how to utilize the client portal really well. But the important thing to know here is it's not going to create a password for them. It's not going to send anything to the client. It literally only turns on the client portal, and that is it. It just makes it so it's available when they click on the link and enter in their password so they can actually get in. Then there's deactivate portal. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I don't think I've ever seen that one time in a workflow in my 4 years of working here. Most people like to just keep the client portal on all the time, even when they're done working with them. But if you ever need to deactivate the client portal for any access or anything like that, you can always use that. So it's available, but I've actually never seen it used one time in a workflow. It's not mandatory, but you can use it if you want to. Then the last thing is archive project, and then we're all done for the day. Archiving the project will archive the project and pause all the workflows. We talked about this yesterday just a little bit, but anytime that you are archiving a project, it's going to pause whatever workflow you have running at that time. A question we got yesterday was, what if I archive a project, but I still have like an anniversary email that needs to go out, or a follow-up email or anything like that? Once it gets into that archive bin, it's going to shut down the workflow. So the best thing that you can do is archive the project at the very end of everything. Once your anniversary email goes out, once you send out your review emails, all of those things, then archive the workflow. So that way it's not getting archived prematurely, and then you don't get those last little things to go out. So Archiving a project with a lead status. This is the last thing that I really want to hit home because it will keep your leads list very clean. And once we build the workflow next week, you'll be able to kind of see this live and start to get an understanding of what's possible. But archiving a project with a lead status, so that means it's in that leads area, is going to erase the invoices that are in this project. Why would you want to do that? Is because let's say you send a proposal out to the client. They're a lead, they're not booked with you yet, but when a proposal gets created, you're going to have that invoice in there. And what you want to have happen is if they decide that they don't want to move forward and you archive that project, you don't want to have to go in and delete that empty invoice. You want it to just remove the invoice. They're not moving forward. So if it's in the lead status and you archive it, it will remove the invoices in that project. If it's in the job status, and let's say you've worked with them, they've paid their invoices and you archive it, that's not going to remove anything off the project. So you don't have to worry about invoices getting deleted. It's only if they're in the lead status. The other thing that I will show you here as we wrap up is if you choose archive project as your action, it actually tells you here, if you archive a lead, any related open invoices will be closed or deleted. So it does warn you when you are putting this action together just in case, but those are only projects in the lead status, not if they are in the job status. So very important to differentiate the two there. So that is everything that I have for today. I know we went a little bit over time. I do apologize. I tried to get through all the actions as quickly as possible, but tomorrow we're going to go over all of the triggers. So the more that we get into these actions and triggers, and then we actually build the workflow next week, I'm not going to have to explain, hey, when you're doing send form, you have to make sure this and this. It's going to make it so once I build the workflow and I'm putting pieces together, you're saying, oh, I know why he's using this action, or I know why he's using this particular trigger. So I wanted to get these two things out of the way. I know it's not as exciting as the first two sessions were, but when you're building workflows, if you don't understand what actions and triggers do specifically in the system, it's very, very hard to put together an efficient workflow.